information assets. And I've been tracking coronavirus pretty closely in a variety of different dimensions since the beginning, basically. And I learned a ton of stuff about it. Some of that stuff is probably stuff you've heard in the news. Some of it is probably stuff you haven't heard. And so I'll share my screen in just a second once I get my notes up for what I want to talk about. Okay. So I'll share the link at the end of this meeting. The dashboard that I'm going to be sharing is publicly available, so you're welcome to look at whatever you want. There's one visual that doesn't work publicly, which is the map visual that's put out by ESRI, the GSI people or GIS people, and so you have to have a license for that. And I want to encourage folks as we talk to ask questions. So there's stuff that occurs to me that might be interesting to everybody, but I'd really like to know what's actually interesting to you, because I've got a lot more data organized than I have time to present. So if there's particular things you'd like to learn about or hear about or that you've wondered about, I'd encourage you to ask about that. And I guess I'll start by asking, is there anything around COVID and the the way that it's played out in our state or our country that you've been curious about, or theories that you've heard that you wonder if there's data that can either prove or disprove them? And I'll take notes on whatever you ask, and then I can make sure to cover it.
This is Aaron. It seems like a lot of the data out there is focused around the volume of cases, where I would think that the hospitalization rate and the death rate are probably the two key items to look at. What's your opinion on that?
It's kind of one of those leading and lagging indicator kind of things. And it's also, I think there's a sense in which you're right. I'll talk at some point about the demographics, what kinds of people are at higher and low risks. And, there's a theory that as a society, we should be working as hard as we can to protect the people that are at high risk and infect the people who are not, so that we get herd immunity. And that has like any country in the world has been open about pursuing that strategy. And so, yeah, I have a visual that I'll be sure to get to, which looks at the death rate over time in different geographic areas, so that most of my charts are also by number of infections, but I'll show you something that'll allow you to correlate the number of infections to the number of deaths. Does that answer your question, Aaron, or was there anything else that you wondered about around that?
That's good for now. I might ask some questions later, though.
Excellent. Others, and I noticed a guy who I'm working with right now, Kevin, has joined the call, which is cool. Anybody else have any questions or comments or things you've been curious about that I can make sure to spend time on?
Why is it so much more lethal in New York than other areas of the country?
Why is the death rate higher in? You've seen a death rate that's higher in New York?
It seemed like there were more people in the ICU and dying in New York City than any other part of the country that's been affected. Is there a trend for that, or a mutant strain or something?
Yeah, we'll definitely look at that. I do have some data that I could pull up on. Actually, you know what? I don't think I have. I might have death rates nationally by state and city. Let's see, and that was DKemp.
Yeah, that was me.
Okay, great. So we'll definitely look at New York, at least in terms of cases and the impacts there. I'll check and see as we go along whether I have information on death rates in New York in particular. I might. Others? I'll give everybody another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll dive in. And you're, of course, welcome to keep asking questions. I remember, Brigitte, when I first announced this, you said you were going to have a lot of questions and challenges for me. So we'll see if that ends up being true or not. Have there been a lot of things that you've seen from the hospital perspective that you've been curious about or haven't made sense? Or
No, I did not do my homework for this assignment.
Your homework being giving me crap. You didn't do your homework. Maybe next time. All right. Well, I believe I'm sharing my screen. Can you guys see?
Yep.
RBI visualization. Okay. So to start with, I did my data modeling here actually in the Power Query backend to Power BI. So using Power BI Desktop, you click on the tab that says, and I have it here so I can look to make sure I'm looking at the right thing. On the transform data area, and there's actually a pretty slick data modeling tool behind Power BI that can do just about everything you can do in SQL Server. It's a little slow to get it to work. Like, it takes a while to do it and things take a while to refresh, but you can do a lot in it. And so it's a pretty slick tool. So I did all the data modeling in that. I'm a database developer, so data modeling is my day-to-day. And then the visualization sort of philosophy that I work under in terms of how you tell stories and how you put together visualizations around data, I think is probably most heavily informed by Edward Tufte. I've read, I think, all of his books and spent a lot of time thinking about how you visualize data. And so he's been the person I've looked to the most for concepts. In terms of, there's a few metrics that I've came up with myself that you're going to see repeated throughout this presentation. One is cases per 10,000. Right, so how many people are actively infectious for 10,000 people in the community, right? So if 100 people are infectious in a community of 10,000 people, that's 1%. So that's a number you'll see a lot. In terms of people who are actually infectious, I've defined that as people who got sick and were tested in the last 12 days. So there hasn't been any really definitive research on how long people can infect others with COVID, but the research that's out there seems to, hover around, like, some studies a little higher, some a little lower. The average seems to be around 12 days, that when somebody's infected, they're infectious for about 12 days. So I'm assuming if somebody was tested as being positive, they're infectious for the next 12 days, which actually they were probably infectious for a few days before, and so they're really infectious for 9 more days or something. But if we use 12 days across everybody, that ends up giving us a reasonable average for how many people are infectious right now. And then I use a concept called 12-day growth rate as a proxy for what everybody calls R naught. So whether your rate is growing or shrinking is how many people were infected in the last 12 days compared to how many people were infected the 12 days before that. So if we look at the last 12 days and we see, 500 people were infected in Dane County, and in the previous 12 days, 400 people were infected, then we have a growth rate that's greater than 1. Any questions about those metrics? You'll see them repeated. I just want you to understand what they are. And scientists and other researchers have come up with really complicated and constantly changing formulas for that. What I'm talking about is the 12-day growth rate, but I think this is a reasonable sort of rule of thumb proxy. So I'll start looking at state by state, and this will get to a little bit of what you saw in New York. So this is number of cases, and we're going to start from the very beginning when COVID first hit the United States and go to the end where we're at now. And you'll see the different size of the bubbles or the population of that state. The colors are the regions. So let's see, what's our region? Wisconsin is blue, which is Midwest. Dark blue is Northeast. So you'll see the regions, and I'll hit play here, and you'll be able to watch what happens from the very beginning. So we're back in early March when only a few people in Washington State had been tested as getting sick. And you should note that I have a multiplier in here for how many people are actually sick. And you immediately see what DeCamp asked about, which is that after Washington had a few people get sick, immediately New York exploded with 100 to 1,000 times as many cases as any other place. And my understanding from the research that's been done is because that was travelers from Italy for the most part who were arriving in New York and bringing the virus with them, and for other places in New York. So New York takes off a huge head start over everybody else, both with the cases per 10,000 and the total number of cases. Cases per 10,000 is the vertical axis. Total number of cases is the historical axis, or the horizontal axis. So New Jersey's following close behind, followed by the other states that you heard about early on. Massachusetts, Louisiana, and Michigan all had pretty high numbers of cases for their population. Louisiana's jumping ahead, Connecticut's jumping ahead. District of Columbia has a high number of cases for the population, also a place where a lot of people travel. Pretty soon you'll see Rhode Island make a move, and it for a while becomes the place where the highest percentage of the population is infected. New York begins to a drop off. They've very consistently dropped off in the last few months to the point where now New York doesn't have a higher number of cases than other places. But we see it was heavily northeast at first, and then a couple of places in the mid-Atlantic region like Delaware and District of Columbia. And the rest of the country has sort of slowly been growing and catching up to the number of cases, and New York and New Jersey are dropping. Rhode Island is still not. So we're at about 3 weeks ago now. We can see Wisconsin in the middle of the pack here. Places that have very few people are infected are the ones that you would expect, like Hawaii and Alaska and Wyoming, which are very remote and distant from other places. Vermont, for whatever reason, has had a relatively low number of cases. So you can see the progression of the various states throughout the whole process that we've been in. And Decamp, that question about New York was that primarily that you saw a lot of deaths in New York, you know, in terms of like a high death rate, or was it just that a lot of people were dying, which could be explained by the dramatically higher number of people infected there?
It seemed like more people were dying in New York, although that was just my sense, than other parts of the country like Florida or Texas or something like that. That seems like they have a lot of cases, but they don't seem like they nearly have the death rate. And question, the size of the spheres is the number of cases? Is that the
size of the spheres, I think, is the population of that state.
Okay.
Yeah. So you see Ohio is maybe 40% larger than Wisconsin, which is their bigger state than we are. Other questions about anything you saw in this chart? I'll do another. I've got 3 bubble races to start out. This one looks at rural versus urban. And I've broken the country down into counties. So counties that have various population sizes. So a very urban county is going to have a lot fewer people. So I've broken the country up into size categories where the total number of people in the United States living in counties of that size is approximately equal. So there's about as many people in the United States who live in counties that have less than 30,000 people. So these bubbles contain approximately the same number of people. So we're going to look and see the impacts that rural versus urban has had on COVID in the United States. So, you know, at the beginning, very few people had been tested as positive, and this is reliant upon tests, like everything else has been. And so you'll see an interesting pattern where the urban areas seem to take off, but then eventually everybody catches up to about the same percentage of the population getting sick. So, you know, this is New York here. This is, you know, other moderate-sized urban areas like a couple cities in Texas, maybe, and here we see, you know, places like Milwaukee. You know, so the places that have large populations have definitely taken off first, both in the number of cases and the portion of people are sick. So here we see people in cities of 3.7 million or more, or counties, and counties of, you know, 1 to 2 million are sick at significantly higher rates than 0 to 29,000 counties, and this is a logarithmic scale. And that was especially true earlier on in the chart, but as we'll see, these start to catch up, right? So it starts to even off, and so this one isn't going any higher, and it starts to drop very slowly by the end of this chart, and the other ones start to catch up. And the other thing that you notice here, which you see just a little bit, which you'll see a lot in some of the other charts, is that everything is very geographically specific. So one county can have a dramatic spike and the county next door can have no impact at all. So right now, Tucson is having a huge spike in cases where they're considering shutting down again. And like 2 counties away where my mom lives, they've had basically no impact whatsoever. So geography is everything. Like, so the state of Wisconsin, different counties are having very different experiences. So any comments or questions about this rural versus urban chart that we just watched?
Cool chart.
Thanks. I'm gonna do one more bubble race, which this is a Wisconsin bubble race showing the counties in Wisconsin, because that's where we all are. So the color codes are the different regions in Wisconsin. This orange is the Northeast region. The similar colored peach is the Southeast region, which has been dominant so far in terms of the number of cases. And then the other regions are here. And I'm wondering if today, and it was good, but I'm wondering if the scale has gotten weird because I see a lot on the left. Yeah, I think it'll be okay. So Fond du Lac took off first and the Milwaukee followed. Yeah, it's interesting. When I watch this on I'm going to open up my local version of Power BI because I have a different scale that'll make this more interesting. So once that opens up, we can watch that in a different screen. But I'll look at some other things in the meantime. Okay. So national cases. This will show a little bit of the New York effect as well. So this chart is an interesting one, and I debate with myself whether this is a really good way of representing this data. So the things that are accurate about this chart are the proportions between the different colors, the magnitude of the different colors, and that's and the effects over time. So these are cases per 10,000 by region. So if you were to like try to come up with a number to represent the total, it would be like cases per 10,000 by region added together. So the totals are not especially meaningful here. They're sort of a proxy in some ways of the total for the United States, but they're not really. They're meant to compare the different regions together. So the Northeast region is like, this was New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts. The Northeast region very quickly became dominant in terms of how many people were getting sick in the United States. And then it got it under control, and it's been a consistent downward trend. The blue is the Midwest, which had a much slower rise and then has had a slower decline. And then the other regions have been relatively similar to the US. They've had growth and decline and then growth and decline. The South has been growing basically the whole time, except for a small period when they had shrunk. And so the pattern in the South has generally been slow but consistent increase in the number of people who are actively infected, meaning they got sick within the past 12 days. If we look at our region in the Midwest, we'll see that the east north central part of the Midwest is where we are, had very rapid growth in the beginning, especially fueled by Michigan and the city of Chicago. The west north central, which includes a lot of states which didn't have any legislation about shutting down at all, like Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska, largely avoided those early effects. There's a lot of rural areas, and then they rapidly caught up. So at this point, the east north central and west north central parts of the country have similar proportions of people affected. If we drill into our region a little bit further, we can look at states. We can see that the one that's had consistently the most people infected has been Illinois here. Michigan also had a big early bump in terms of the number of people that were infected, and then it's sort of tapered off. People are infected, but that's most recently become less. And then we'll look into Wisconsin counties in a little bit. Any questions about national trends from these bar charts?
Jeremiah, do you think that the stacked charts are the best way to demonstrate the trends because they sort of hide the decrease in one area is offset by an increase in another, or the other way around? Is there a better way to present that?
Like I mentioned at the beginning, I debated with myself around that. The things that I was just trying to talk about, I feel like this actually illustrates pretty well. Because we're looking at relatively large areas, you miss a lot of detail. But we can also look at like I have a line chart, which is looking at the same data. And so you can see, the same trend with the Northeast. And I can drill into the Midwest just like I did before. And you can see a comparison between the East North Central and West North Central region, where we took off more quickly and then they caught up and now we're in the same pace. And then we can look at one state at a time and we can see the effects. So, depending on exactly what you're trying to look at, this one can be more effective.
Knowing that the number of tests done is way higher than what it was back even a month ago, how do you think the test volume skews the data?
That's an interesting question, and I actually have some slides specifically about that. So part of the way that I estimated how many people were actually sick is by comparing the average number of percentage of people who've been tested and who so there was a really interesting data analytics study about a month ago that looked at sort of a compendium of all the other studies that have been done worldwide and the assumptions that they'd made and how far along they were in cases and how much of a percentage of the population was being tested daily to try to come up with a model that would estimate what percentage of people who actually got sick ended up dying. And they came up with a number that was about 1.25%. And so I took Wisconsin's numbers, which I really probably ought to have done this in a dynamic way, but on average now, about 3.5% of people who are being tested positive in Wisconsin are dying, which, every population is a little bit different, but if we assume Wisconsin is similar in its population characteristics to the rest of the world, that means that about 3% of people, or 3 times as many people, are getting sick as are being tested as positive. And so, yeah, tests have a big impact on that. And we'll look at in a little bit.
Does that model assume, though, that the death rate stays the same all the time, though? Because it seems like they've found better ways to treat people, too, at the same time.
I don't know if they've assumed that. I've assumed that for the purposes of these charts because I didn't get complicated enough to make the model dynamic, where if the percentage of people who have been tested positive that are dying is higher, then I adjust the number of people that are likely sick, or are lower, then I also adjust the number of people who are likely sick. So I'm assuming a static value. I don't know what they're assuming in that study.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about tests in a little bit. And actually, that's my next one. I'm going to talk about testing percent positive. So we're looking nationwide here by region. So this is the percent of tests that have come back as positive. And there was a recommendation put out by the CDC at one point that we, to maintain like a good understanding and to be able to prevent major outbreaks, or at least respond to them when they occur, we want to keep the percent of positive tests below 10%. So 90% of people who get tested would be negative in that case. So we can see how that has played out over different states over the course of, COVID history. And early on, it was all over the map. People were running out of tests and people were having major spikes in number of cases and all things were crazy. So the beginning was just Wild West. And then, the thing with New York happened where so many people were sick that there was no way that they could have 90% of the tests be negative, because arguably like more than 10% of people were actually sick at one point. And so, so that was an impossible goal for them. And so their percentage of positive tests went way up to about 1 in 3 at one point. Looking at the Midwest as a whole was always less, well, except for the early days. Generally, as soon as they got testing sort of figured out at the beginning of April, have been less than 20% of people have been testing as positive. And now we're below 10% testing as positive, and we've been there for a couple of weeks. Other parts of the country, the South and the West, have been consistently below 10%. If we look more detailed at the Midwest, into the 2 parts of the Midwest, we see that the West North Central, because its cases grew more slowly, was it was easier for them to maintain a less than 10% rate. And then we've converged around 8 or 9% of tests are positive. If we look a little more detail into states, we can see Michigan, which had a very rapid growth in the beginning, and Ohio, which had a crazy spike, had a very high percentage of tests coming back as positive, 50% in Michigan for a while, and then that dropped rapidly as the number of cases dropped rapidly. If we look at Wisconsin, the greenish one here, we have always been below 10% of cases, 10% of tests coming back positive. Wisconsin's been a relatively, comparatively safe place to be compared to a lot of other states. Any questions about these tests? There's another way of looking at testing, which is the number of people who are tested for every 100,000 people on an average day. And so, you know, partly because New York had such a big problem and the other parts of the Northeast, they tested a lot of people. So for every 100,000 people in that region, they were testing, you know, 1,300 every day, right? So that means like 1 out of every 80 people was getting a test on the average day, which that's a lot. The Midwest has continued to increase the number of people we've tested, which has been an intentional goal. And now the Midwest is testing 600 people for every 100,000 on the average day. If we drill in a little bit more, and we could drill into the Northeast just to see how much New York itself was doing in the Mid-Atlantic region. And we see New York as a state was testing almost 2,000 people now for every 100,000 people. So that's like, you know, 1 out of every 50 people gets a test every day. So, you know, that's a lot. Midwest is now, here I'll look in more details at the states in terms of how many people are getting tested. Illinois is testing the most. 1 in every 1,000 people in Illinois is being tested every day now. Wisconsin's at 394 people every day that are being tested. And you know, this probably kind of makes sense because if a state has a higher infection rate, which states with larger cities tend to have had, at least in the past, that's starting to change. Those would be places where having higher numbers of tests would be more important because you'd want to catch outbreaks quickly. Questions about this test chart or tests in general? All right, now I'm going to focus on Wisconsin. And let me look at Wisconsin testing. Let's see, where do I have? I think I have that here. So here we have testing by county in Wisconsin. And as I mentioned, we've been pretty consistently below 10% of positive tests. I believe there's been a few days here and there where more than 10% of people has tested as positive, but we've been generally around 10%. And then in recent weeks, we've been significantly below. I have it by every county. And so this is how many total tests were done for each day. So, you know, 10 to 15,000 tests. I'll look at Dane County here. And Dane County has always been doing pretty good in terms of the tests per positive. So right now it's like, you know, 2% of tests are coming back positive, which is really good from that perspective. Does this account for the same person being tested more than once? Tammy asks, and yes, it does. It's just tests, number of tests. So, you know, this could theoretically account for somebody that just really likes being tested 3 times a day for the whole time. I suppose that's possible. But yeah, I don't have any more information on how many times individuals were tested. Any other counties anybody wants to look at? We will notice that Brown County has had an interesting history. I don't know why. Apparently they had one day where they reported negative number of tests complete. Maybe they lost some or something. But yeah, they've had pretty big spikes where 80% of people on this day tested positive. You know, 60% of people on this day tested positive. Brown County had a really big series of spikes around, you know, the publicly given reason was manufacturing, like food processing plants. Any other county anybody wants to see test rates on? All right, let's look at Wisconsin cases. So Northeast, North, South Central, Southeast, and West Central are the regions, and you can see them here, right? So here's North, Northeast, Southeast, South Central, and West Central. These are the regions of Wisconsin. We can see what's happened across the regions over the course of time. The Southeast region has generally been leading, and that's probably largely just because it's a highly populated region, and it's between two major cities, Milwaukee and Chicago, which get a lot of traffic. And you know, I don't know if there's anything else to be said about those regions other than there's just more people and it's more dense, and there's multiple dense counties right next to each other. But that's consistently been the region that's had the highest number of cases. The peak was 29 people per 10,000 in the Southeast region had an active case of COVID. That's dropped significantly since then, which is about 3 weeks ago. Now down to about 15 people per 10,000. So we'll talk a little bit later about the effects of major events. But you know, we can think about what's been happening in the last 15 days and the effect that it's had on things, if any. The South Central region had a big spike, which was Rock County right here. We can see that in a minute. And you know, now South Central region's back to 6 cases per 10,000 people, which is really low from a national perspective. If we do look in more detail at the Southeast region, which has the most people who are sick, Milwaukee, the biggest city, has got the highest number of people who are sick per 10,000 at 44, followed by Racine and Kenosha.
Jeremiah, do you know if those tests are just the viral tests if they currently have it, or if those numbers also include the antibody tests, which they've had it in the past?
This is viral tests, and this is number of people who are actively infectious.
Thanks.
Yep. So if somebody had it in the past, they wouldn't show up on here. If we look in the South Central region, we see that Dane County, let's see, this is actually cases per 10,000 live. This is cases per 10,000. Let's see, I wonder if I have another one that has cases live on this right chart. Yeah, this one might be a better one. So if we look at the Southeast region of Wisconsin, that was aggregate cold cases per 10,000. And I was actually surprised by that because it missed the big jump in Racine. For a while, Racine had a huge number of people who were sick per 10,000 people. It had 186 people per 10,000, which was, I think, the highest that any county in Wisconsin has ever gotten to. At this point, here's where we're at. Kenosha has 46 people, and it shows the population here too. Milwaukee is 80, and Racine has 53 per 10,000 people. If we look at our region, the South Central region, we see this big spike. Dodge County had a lot of people get sick. And we'll look county by county in a little bit, and you'll see some interesting trends. If we look at Dane County here, let's see. You see, you know, we're kind of the beige one down here. We spiked early on to get up to about 20 cases per 10,000 people. And, you know, we've recently hit that spike about again, 21 cases per 10,000, and now we've dropped slightly below that, down to 19. So Dane County has been relatively stable. We've had ups and downs, but we've never had any major spikes to be like Milwaukee or Brown County or anywhere else. And I will look one county at a time here real quick. So if we look at, let's see, what's the best way to do this? Maybe I'll do, can I do counties over here? Let's see. I'll look at South Central region, which is us, and county. So Columbia County, we see this interesting thing here. They were at 4 cases per 10,000 people, and then they jumped up to 17 or 18, and then they went back down. If we go to Dodge County, the less populated counties, you know, they didn't have a lot of cases, and then they jumped up to 150 per 10,000. If we look at Grant County, we see a similar pattern. Not a lot of cases, and then a huge spike up to here, and then a drop, and then a spike, and then a drop. Greene County, we see a similar pattern, massive spike and then drop off, you know, sort of with a couple of resurgences. And we see this in a lot of these less populated counties, which is interesting to me. And I have a theory, which I don't have data to prove, which is that, and you know, there have been other people that have made this theory too, which is that the virus spreads not one person to another person, like, you know, you visit somebody's house, Marathon and Wood counties, yeah, I can pull those up. But it spreads frequently in big bunches, right? So somebody's sick and they go to an event, right? They go to a wedding, or they go to church, or they go to something where there's a lot of other people, and they get everybody sick, and all of a sudden 100 people are sick who weren't before, and then maybe they spread it slowly to their families, and then it kind of peters out. But it seems like these big events of people giving it to a lot of other people is the biggest like impact. let's see. And that, like, when you look at the smaller counties that don't have as much people, so here's Wood County. Wood County's in the midst of a spike right now, but its spike is pretty moderate. It's up to 10 cases per 10,000 compared to, you know, under 1 before. And then Marathon, somebody wanted to look at that one too. Marathon County is also exhibiting a spike right now, but that spike being defined as 10 cases per 10,000 people, so 0.1% of people being actively infectious. And these are more rural counties, and so it's possible that a smaller percentage of the people are getting tested, so it could be worse than that. But from the data that we can see, it doesn't appear to be bad, although they're increasing. We'll look at growth rate here. So this is what I talked about earlier, 12 days compared to the previous 12 days. Let's see, where are we filtered on Adams County right here? It's interesting. Oh, it's because it's doing some kind of odd summarizing thing. So from a 12-day growth rate perspective, what you're looking for is below 1, right? So if your growth rate for your area is above 1, that means more people are getting sick than are getting better. If your growth rate is below 1, that means more people are getting better than are getting sick. So if you want stability, right, so if some region decided to play that game where it was trying to infect low-risk people and trying to keep high-risk people safe, then you would want a growth rate of above 1 amongst low-risk people and a growth rate that's low for high-risk people. But that's not the strategy that we've been pursuing. We've been pursuing trying to keep growth as low as possible, I think with the hope that a vaccine will eventually come out. So we see like Wisconsin everywhere was above 1 for a while because nobody was sick. And so the growth rate for people to get sick has to be above 1. You know, there was a point where the growth rate for New York City was like 1,000,000%. I mean, it was crazy. And then it drops off and it's got stable. And so, you know, now all of the areas of Wisconsin are hovering a little bit above or a little bit below 1%. So if you look at the South Central region where we are, and why is it doing this on me? Something's up with Power BI, app.powerbi.com in my visual right now. I think I might need to show it with Power BI desktop. Let's see. I think I appear to have memory errors right now. Let's see, it's gonna let me save it. Our open update was around mid to late May. Yep. So the date at which the state Supreme Court overrode the governor's plan to have safer at home was, I think, May 15th. Does anybody know if it was actually a different day? I think that was the day. Let's see. Yeah, my Power BI desktop isn't going to work. Lovely.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right about that.
Okay. I'm going to try to open it one more time and see if it comes up. Otherwise, let's see, where else can I look at stuff? I can't look at growth rate by state except for region except for Adams County because Power BI doesn't like me right now.
Did you select Adams County on the state map?
No, I haven't. So like if I select Dane County right here, it won't show anything up here. It thinks that Adams County is the only county in this chart. And it might have something to do with this summarization thing that it does. It hasn't done this for me before. I've gone through this and I don't know why it's choosing to do it now. Maybe a lot of people are on powerbi.com or something. May 13th, okay. So we can look at the number of cases and I'll pull it up with log growth rates here. That's cases per 10,000, so it's not active cases. This one will be a better one. So if we look at, let's see, I'll clear this. Actually, no, I do want it to be Wisconsin. I don't want all the other states. And I think I'm filtered on county, so I'm gonna clear that one. So if you look in the last 15 days, we do see some effects. So like in particular, when I was looking at, let's see, and why is this allowing a blank here? Oh, well, I'm not going to worry about it. If we look at certain regions, we see effects over the last 15 days. So May 13th is here. And so since May 13th, we've seen a significant rise in actively sick people in Dane County, or in the South Central region. We've seen a significant rise in the Southeast region, but it's hard to say that that had anything to do with it, right? Because we saw this slope of upward growth, and then we saw that slope continue. So did anything change? Was there opening up? Your region filter is showing an issue like an illegal. Oh, that's that in the other chart. Yeah. I think there's a, this filter is, yeah, it's a value that was in there in the past that's not in there. I think I published my desktop file and it didn't actually publish. And I'm gonna get this Zoom thing out of the way so I can maybe even see what's going on with it. Oh, it wasn't letting me select that. I was okay with the S3 agreement. So I'm gonna stop sharing this and I'll start sharing Power BI Desktop because I know my data in there had been working better. I do want to see my filters. Okay, can you guys see Power BI Desktop?
Yep.
So yes or no? Okay. So I'm looking at Wisconsin 2-week growth rate. Here we go. All right, so looking back to May 13th, I don't see a particularly meaningful positive growth since May 13th compared to what was there before, right? So we see this rapid growth in the southeastern region of the state that basically stops about the 13th and then goes downward. And so if that had some kind of significant impact on the growth rate, I'm not seeing it in the southeast region. I'm also not seeing it in the west central region. The only regions you could arguably say that you're seeing it is in the south central or south northeast regions. But so far, I'm not seeing a huge impact of the opening up legislation. I'm also not seeing any particular impact of protests, right? So in the last couple of weeks in Milwaukee, which has had protests, and then Dane County, which has had protests, which I can actually filter on those counties one at a time. Let's see, where's my county one? Right, because that was something I was concerned about. You know, I knew people who were attending them, and I was wondering what effect that would have on things. But when I look at Dane County and Milwaukee counties, the ones that had the, had the largest numbers of people protesting, I don't see any effect. From early June till onwards, I see 12-day growth rates that are, dropping. So in Dane County, they were significantly above 1%, and now they're below 1% or 1. Same with Milwaukee, or they're about at or below 1. Any other questions about growth rates in Wisconsin?
Hey, Jeremiah. So is there some conclusion I should draw from that? Or, I mean, like, I know everything is political these days, and I don't want to turn this discussion into something like that, but.
So there's a few conclusions that I'm sort of coming to. One is that, large gatherings of young people outdoors mostly wearing masks appears not to lead to big spikes. Right before this meeting, I was starting to gather the counties nationwide of all the places that had the biggest protests to see if they've seen any effect. We haven't seen it in Wisconsin. In terms of the legislation, right, the opening up, I'll get to that directly, and maybe I should just get to that now. So this is an interesting chart. This is called small multiples, if it lets me load it. This looks at every state, and I have it color-coded by whether they were closed off, whether they had, or before when they closed, and then after they closed, or for the states that never did. The purple ones here never had any kind of closure. The ones that are multicolored, dark blue was before they had legislation closing things off. Orange is when the legislation closed things off, and then the lighter blue is after the reopening began. And I didn't try to get into here as to whether beauty salons were reopened versus grocery stores or what. That was more, manual data analytics than I was interested in doing. So once they started doing some kind of reopening, they turned blue here. And you can look at these like one at a time, and I've looked at all of them. I don't see any particularly meaningful trend. Like you see news outlets saying, right now, like Florida and Texas and Arkansas and Arizona are growing in cases really quickly, and they're trying to attribute that to reopening. But when I look at states around the country, I don't see that reopening has had any significant pattern. So like we look at New York here, and obviously New York was dropping very significantly, and then they reopened and they had no other effects. If we were to look at North Dakota, we'd say they had a lockdown and then they reopened and then cases grew. We could also look at Wyoming and say, hey, they had a lockdown, cases grew, and then they reopened and cases dropped. So like there's an example of everything, right? So Michigan, they reopened and cases continued to drop. Minnesota, they reopened, cases stayed stable. Louisiana, similar thing. Montana. The conclusion that I come to is essentially like people have internalized that they need to be careful, and how careful people are being is it's probably driven by who they look to as like leaders. So the fact that a president doesn't wear a mask, maybe some people look to him and think maybe I shouldn't do that either. But legislation appears not to be the driving factor in whether people are getting sick. It appears to be other things. And I don't have data on how many people are wearing masks or how many people are going to work and stuff like that. Does that answer your question, Jake?
Enough for now. Like I don't want to get into a huge political discussion. I just want to see what conclusion you might be drawing from that. One of the conclusions I draw maybe is there something else in play that isn't represented in these graphs. Like you said, people are just more careful whether or not the state reopens or doesn't, right? Or you said something like whether people look to a certain leader or what have you. So
yeah, like I haven't looked to see whether like
play.
Beyonce, for example, has been wearing a mask on TV. I don't know if she has. Maybe people are listening to her.
Right. So there's some other piece of data that isn't being considered, right? Because otherwise you would expect to see more or less the same shape.
Yeah, and I mean it's true that like one person can have a huge impact. Like there's like what I showed with one county at a time in the small counties of Wisconsin. If you had somebody that was sick that just decided they want to go like breathe on everybody in town, they could probably get hundreds of people sick. One of the early events in Massachusetts, there was a conference where they found out later that somebody had come and gotten like half the people at the conference sick. So it's like the individual choice of a small number of people can make a really big impact. And it's so much luck too, right? So like, let's say you have a big event. Let's say in Madison, we had a big event with 5,000 people at it. There's a chance that somebody was sick who came to that event, right? We have on average 10 people for every 10,000. So probably someone would be sick at that event. So it depends on how many sessions they went to and whatnot. Like, but you could also have a situation where nobody was. With our rate of sickness, it's completely reasonable that a gathering of 5,000 people would have nobody with COVID at it. So that's just luck as to whether that works out or not. I got some more stuff that we should look at. So let's look at demographics.
Sorry, one more question. Are you able to cut this by either average age or kind of what region it is?
I can do that in Wisconsin. Got that right here.
Right.
So I can see, and I don't have exactly that same chart, but I can see the percentage of positive tests by age group over time. And, this will also show the impacts of age and death rates and stuff, but we all know that older people are more susceptible to the disease, to having a serious case. So what you would hope is that over time, a smaller percentage of older people would be testing positive and a larger percentage of younger people would be testing positive, which means we're doing a good job of protecting the most vulnerable people. And we see exactly that. So early on, 10 to 11% of people in of positive tests were people in their 70s. And 5 to 6% were people in their 80s, and a significant percent were people in their 90s, which there's no way that 2% of the population's in their 90s. Most people don't live that long. And now it's down to 6% of people. A higher percentage of positive tests now are younger people. We see death rates. So for people who have tested positive, here's the percentage of people who've died. So people in their 90s, 31% of people who've tested positive in their 90s have passed away of it. 20% of people in their 80s, 14% of people in their 70s, and then it drops off quickly. So 5% of people in their 60s, 2% of people in their 50s, and below that, it's significantly less. You know, where essentially nobody who's less than 20 has died of it. And then we look at the percent of the, and this is interesting to me in terms of who's being tested. And it also indicates something to me as to who is showing symptoms and who doesn't. So this is the percentage of the population of the state of Wisconsin who's been tested, or actually the number of tests that have been given to that group divided by the population within that group. So 0.34% of people over 90 in Wisconsin have been tested approximately. 0.25% of people over 80. And that's relatively stable down to people in their 20s. And then we drop to people who are under 20, and we see that almost nobody's been tested. A very small percentage of kids are being tested, which the most obvious explanation, which I don't have proof for this, is that people aren't showing symptoms if they're under 20, right? There's no reason to have them tested because there's no reason to think that they were sick, unless you know that they happen to have contact with the person who you know was sick, and so you do the contact tracing and you test them. So I guess if you're trying to calibrate your behavior, stay away from kids, because you won't even know. You know, this isn't like definitive proof, but this seems to point kind of in that direction. Questions about this from an age perspective? This is Wisconsin data too. So yeah, that's why all the attention on nursing homes. And I don't have a chart on this, but I have seen articles that Wisconsin has done a really good job of preventing the major outbreaks in nursing homes that they saw in other parts of the country. So we've been pretty good at not having crazy nursing home incidents. Here's race and ethnicity data. Some of these things aren't exactly like one survey defines people one way and another survey defines people the other way. So here's the percentage of positive tests that occurred within each ethnic group. So 52, and it's been relatively stable. The one impact that I have seen is the percentage of positive tests that are in the Black community has gone down quite a bit. That could be in part driven by the fact that urban areas had a much higher incidence of cases early on, and now the incidence of cases as a percentage of the population is similar between urban and rural areas. So, you know, the Black community has had early on, a much disproportionate portion of the Black community was getting infected. That's still true, but it's less. Percent positive by race, right? So the percentage of the population of the state that's African American that got sick is 0.61%. This I don't think is accurate. It's like multi-ethnic other, which I think there's different numbers being divided by different numbers. So I wouldn't trust this. Asian, American Indian, and then Caucasian down here. The percentage of the overall population of the state who has tested positive. So 0.1% of Caucasian people, 0.6% of African Americans. So early on and then continuing, African Americans seem to be getting sick at rates higher than white people. The death rates, this was talked a lot about earlier, that African Americans are dying at higher rates, not significantly higher rates, slightly higher rates. So that was a big discussion point a while ago, but it seems to have kind of leveled off. Any questions about ethnicity here or race? We look at gender, and just like in most things, when it comes to living longer and getting diseases, women generally do better than men. That extra duplicate chromosome really helps. So death rates, about 3% of women who get sick, who test positive, have died. 4% of men who've tested positive has died in the state of Wisconsin. We see the percent of positive tests has been relatively close to 50%. Early on, a little bit higher percentage of women were testing positive than men, but it's kind of leveled off. Any questions about gender? I've got one here that's kind of interesting. This little bit over here in the corner is actually really interesting. I don't know how well you guys remember, but early on there was this big like to-do about who's going to get the ventilators. The ventilator, politicians are like making deals with their friends in Florida and sending ventilators there when they're not sending them to New York. And then all that discussion went away. And the reason my understanding is that all that discussion went away is that ventilators don't appear to save people's lives in any significant way. You know, the percentage of people who've been sent to the ICU versus the percentage of people who've died has consistently increased. And it's been consistently high. So going to the ICU, meaning you need critical care, meaning you need a ventilator, if you're there because you got COVID, that's a death sentence. So if you're put on a ventilator, the odds of you surviving are very low. And doctors have realized this, and so they've stopped putting people on ventilators. They're doing things like just having people lay on their side and stuff like that. And if they're not able to breathe and they're not able to get enough oxygen just out of air, the odds that a ventilator is going to help have been proven to be pretty low. And if you get a ventilator put into you, that means tubes in you, that means lots of medicine, other things they have to do, which also carry risks. And so if somebody goes to the ICU, that's generally, a pretty high percentage indicator that it's not going to end well for them. So hospitalizations, positive tests in the state of Wisconsin, is this total over time? I think this might be total number of positive tests is 22,000 positive tests in the state. 3,000 people have been hospitalized, and then 660 have been in the ICU, and 682 have died. So hospitalization, 1 out of every 10 or so people have been hospitalized, and then out of that, maybe 1 out of 5 people who've been hospitalized has passed away. And there's been a lot of debate about, are the numbers of people who've died of coronavirus overestimated or underestimated, right? Because you go to the hospital, you die, you had COVID, but maybe you also had a heart condition. And so did you die of COVID or the heart condition? The best data I've seen on that has been comparison of people who died this year, just in general, for any reason, compared to people who died on average in the last 5 years during the same time frame. And it's been pretty consistent across countries. On average, about 30% more people have died than in previous years, plus known attributed coronavirus deaths, right? So when you take the number of people who normally would have died this year, and then you add the number of people who died of COVID that we know about 30% people more have died than that. So probably that means, and there could be other reasons that are outside of the data, but it seems likely that we're actually underestimating the number of people who died from COVID instead of overestimating it. That's my demographic stuff. I was going to show a little bit on death rates. Does anybody else have any questions on demographics or comments? So this is, again, Wisconsin data here. And this is regional death rates. So the number of people who tested positive divided by the number of people who died. And it's pretty interesting. I don't know what it means exactly that, so these are the counties where, these are populous counties where there have been a significant number of positive tests and a significant number of deaths. So Brown County, for some reason, had a very low death rate, and then its death rate has crept up. Milwaukee County has had a pretty high death rate, and its death rate has dropped. Other places have had high death rates that dropped rapidly, like Racine County. Kenosha County has been relatively stable. Dane County has went high and then has dropped slowly. So, for a while it looked like the death rate based on positive tests was around 5%. Now it's dropped to around 3.5% as an average on the state. And so this is probably a response of the number of people who are tested. It might also be related to how well we've done at protecting people who are high risk. Generally, death rates are lower than they were early on in terms of the percentage of people who've been tested positive and are dying. Aaron, you had a question about this. Does this answer your question, or do you have other questions about this?
Are those ones that are, how did they know that those people had COVID? Was it through a test, or were there?
Yep. Positive tests
positive test?
divided by deaths.
Okay.
Actually, the opposite, deaths by positive tests.
I've heard some speculation that some death rate numbers are assumed, because if you look at like the influenza death rate, that's down to like 0, and it tapered off pretty quick with the kind of coincided with the increase in COVID cases. And there's wonder if some of the influenza deaths were attributed to COVID.
It's possible. I mean, the COVID test has been known to have, what is it, false negatives. I don't know that it's been known to have really any false positives. The false negatives and have been mostly people who were sick and they're starting to get better. And so they don't have many antibodies, like they don't have many COVID germs in their system that you can like get from a swab. An alternative explanation to what you were saying is like, COVID is a lot more infectious than the flu, right? So if everybody's being really careful to the point that COVID isn't spreading much, the flu isn't going to spread at all, because the amount that you have to be careful to prevent the spread of flu is a lot less than you have to be careful to prevent the spread of COVID. So if people are being careful about preventing the spread of COVID, flu is going to die in its tracks sort of naturally, I think. So I don't know if that's the entire explanation, but you would expect that to happen. So I don't know that that means people are assuming things or not. But I don't know if flu would be a great reason to think that they were. All right, we're at 7 o'clock. I've presented everything that I wanted to share. There is one other thing that I found in a spreadsheet when I just did some back of the envelope calculations here, which is, one of the big ethical debates is how many years of life is the average person losing who dies of COVID. And so, based on the age of death and actuarial statistics for how much longer is a 90-year-old person supposed to live on average, the average person who passed away from COVID probably lost about 11 years of life. And I also did some numbers on actual like things that you can do, like how risky are various things, and at about the infection rates that Dane County is right now. If you went to the grocery store about 350 times, you would have a 1% risk of getting infected from going to the grocery store. If you visited a household of a friend of yours and there was, let's say, 5 people in there, you could do that about 5 times a month of visiting a household full of 5 people who you're not related to give yourself about a 1% chance of getting COVID this year from visiting households of 5 people. Early on, it was thought that people in high-risk professions, like people who work at the grocery store, were dramatically more at risk of getting COVID. I don't know if that's been proven or not. I haven't seen any great studies that actually looked at that question. So I don't know whether they do or not. Like, so if you're going to go visit a neighbor and you find out that they work at the grocery store, should you not visit them? I don't know the answer to that question. Certainly, they'd probably be higher risk than someone who, like me, works in their basement, but don't know for sure. Okay.
I have a question for you, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
So for the death rates, did you just assume that like age was consistently distributed across those different counties? Or is it, I could see with a small set like this, if there's an incident in a nursing home or something like that that affected a large population of vulnerable folks, that it could really skew the numbers in a set like this.
I only looked at age in the context of the chart that I was showing about age. Age is not, it's not a variable in any of the other charts, and I'm not derating by age. That'd be an interesting thing to do. Like if you came up with an expected curve of death rates by age, and then you mapped that onto counties and divided everything by the expected percentage of each age group that would die, what would you get? The problem is that I don't have deaths by age by county. I only have deaths by age statewide.
The thing that made me think of that was the Brown County line, right? You mentioned that the theory is that the spread there is manufacturing, people who are going to work, so working age people.
Yeah, that's the theory. Even you were electronic when you were speaking, Kevin. I caught what you said at the end. I didn't catch what you said at the beginning.
So I was thinking that with Brown County being as low as it was from a death rate, that, you know, because those are, the theory is the spread was largely employed people, right? Working age people. So from that standpoint, you know, that would be different than the general population. And that might partially explain why their rate is so much lower.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, that would be additional evidence for that theory. Does anybody happen to know of a county in Wisconsin that is dominated by older people? I mean, Bayfield County might be, but I don't know if that's true. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate you listening and asking questions. And if you have more questions, you're welcome to send me an email. I will type my email in the chat box.
Great. Thank you very much for that informative walkthrough of the data that's out there. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm going to sign off here. Thanks again, Jeremy.